My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and until that night, I believed that no matter how complicated families could be, there were still lines people wouldn't cross. I was wrong. The dinner was supposed to be simple. Just a Sunday evening at my grandparents' house. Roast chicken. Too many side dishes. The same long table we had been sitting around for decades. I almost didn't go. Work had been exhausting, and I had spent most of the afternoon driving my grandmother to a follow-up appointment and picking up her prescriptions. By the time I arrived, I was tired, hungry, and not expecting anything more dramatic than the usual complaints about food being too salty. I sat near my grandparents, like always. Halfway through dinner, my aunt cleared her throat. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to pull the room into silence. "I think we need to talk about something important," she said, placing her fork down carefully. I looked up, confused. She didn't look at me at first. She looked at my grandparents. "I've been very concerned lately," she continued, "about how much pressure you've been under." My grandmother frowned. "What pressure?" My aunt sighed, the kind of sigh that sounded practiced. "About money," she said. Then she finally turned toward me. "And about how Emily has been influencing you." The word hung in the air. Influencing? I felt my stomach drop. "What?" I said. It came out quieter than I expected. My aunt folded her hands together. "You're always here, always involved in their finances, always helping with things that shouldn't be your responsibility." I opened my mouth to speak, but she didn't stop. "I think it's time we acknowledge that Emily has been manipulating Mom and Dad for money." The table went completely silent. No one laughed. No one asked her to clarify. Everyone just looked at me. My cousins avoided my eyes. My parents stared at their plates. My grandparents looked confused, hurt, but overwhelmed. "That's not true," I said, my heart pounding. "I've never asked them for money. I don't even have access to their accounts." My aunt shook her head slowly, like she'd expected this exact response. "That's exactly what someone would say," she replied. "You've positioned yourself as indispensable. You make them feel dependent on you." I felt heat rise to my face. "I help because they need help," I said. "Doctor visits, groceries, medications. That's it." My aunt leaned back in her chair. "Then explain why they're always short on money," she said calmly. My grandfather shifted uncomfortably. We have had some trouble lately." Every eye snapped back to me. I felt trapped. I wanted to shout, to demand proof, to ask why no one was questioning her instead. But the truth was simple and terrifying. They didn't need proof. They needed a story that made sense. And in that moment, I was the easiest villain at the table. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. "I won't argue at the dinner table," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. "But I will say this. If anyone actually wants the truth, I'm not afraid of it." No one responded. I grabbed my coat and walked out, my hands trembling. At the time, I thought that was the worst moment of my life. I had no idea that a few weeks later, a stack of bank records would expose who had really been draining my grandparents' account, quietly, consistently, and without anyone noticing. By the next morning, the accusation had already settled into something heavier than anger. It had become suspicion. My phone buzzed with short, carefully worded messages. "Are you okay? Things just got misunderstood. You know your aunt worries too much." No one asked me directly if what she said was true. That told me everything. I had always been close to my grandparents, but not in the way my aunt had painted it. There was no secret access, no whispered conversations about money, no manipulation, just routine, responsibility, and time. 3 years earlier, when my grandfather's arthritis worsened and my grandmother started forgetting appointments, I was the one who adjusted my schedule. I lived the closest. I worked flexible hours. I was single. No kids. Everyone agreed. It made sense for me to help. At first, it was small things. Driving them to medical appointments, sitting in waiting rooms with outdated magazines, picking up prescriptions when the pharmacy lines were too long for them to stand. Then came the paperwork, insurance forms they didn't understand, utility bills with confusing charges, letters they were afraid to open because they didn't want to do something wrong. I never touched their bank account, not once. If a bill needed to be paid online, I sat next to them while they typed in their password. If cash was needed, my grandfather withdrew it himself. I refused every offer of money for gas or time. "Family helps family," my grandmother would say, pressing a folded bill into my hand. And every time, I pushed it back. That night after the dinner, I replayed every memory, wondering how easily all of that had been twisted into something ugly. The worst part wasn't my aunt's accusation. It was how quickly everyone accepted it. Suddenly, moments that had once been ordinary felt suspicious in hindsight. Me sitting at the kitchen table helping my grandmother read a statement. Me reminding my grandfather about due dates. Me answering calls because they didn't hear the phone ring. To them, it no longer looked like care. It looked like control. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice was gentle, too gentle. "Emily," she said, "you know we love you. But you have to understand how it looks." "How it looks?" I asked. "You're very involved," she replied, "and your aunt just wants to protect her parents." "So do I said quietly. There was a pause. "Well," my mother continued, "maybe it would help if you stepped back a little, just to avoid misunderstandings." I hung up feeling hollow. Stepping back meant leaving my grandparents alone with their confusion and medical needs, but staying meant living under a shadow I hadn't created. That was when I noticed something that hadn't made sense for a while. My grandmother had started mentioning money shortages months ago. Small comments at first. "We must be spending too much lately. Prices really have gone up, haven't they? I don't understand where it all goes." At the time, I assumed inflation, medical costs, unexpected expenses. But now, the timing felt wrong. They had stable retirement income, no new loans, no large purchases, and yet, every month, the same concern returned. I drove over the following weekend with groceries and sat with my grandmother while she sorted mail. She hesitated before pulling out a bank statement. "I don't like looking at these," she admitted. "They make me anxious." "Why?" I asked gently. She pointed to the balance. "It's always lower than I expect." I leaned closer, not to take it from her, but to see. There were multiple withdrawals, regular ones, not random. I felt something shift inside me. "Grandma," I said carefully, "would you like me to come with you to the bank sometime? Just to ask questions?" She looked relieved. "Would you?" That moment made one thing clear. If I stayed silent, the lie would harden into truth. And if I walked away, whoever had been quietly draining their account would keep doing it, comfortably hidden behind my ruined reputation. I wasn't looking to fight my family. I was looking for facts. Because accusations fade. But bank records don't. Once suspicion takes root, it doesn't need evidence to grow. It feeds on tone, on implication, on who sounds the most confident when everyone else is uncertain. My aunt understood that better than anyone. After the dinner, she didn't confront me again directly. She didn't have to. She let the story travel for her. By the time the next family gathering came around, I could feel it the moment I walked in. Conversations paused. Laughter softened. People smiled at me the way you smile at someone you're not sure you trust anymore. My aunt sat at the center of it all, calm and composed. She greeted me warmly, too warmly. "There she is," she said, standing to hug me. "I'm so glad you came." I stiffened but returned the hug. Everyone was watching. If I reacted, I'd look defensive. If I stayed quiet, I'd look guilty. She knew that. Throughout the afternoon, she played her role perfectly. Whenever my grandparents spoke, she hovered nearby. If my grandmother mentioned a bill or an appointment, my aunt jumped in. "Don't worry, Mom. she said gently. We'll take care of it. When my grandfather struggled to remember details, she filled in the blanks. It looked like devotion. What it really was control. At one point, she casually brought up money again, carefully framing it as concern. I just hate seeing them stressed, she said to the room. Especially when they shouldn't be at their age. Her eyes flicked to me for half a second. No accusation, no raised voice. Just suggestion. People nodded. That must be hard for you, my cousin said to her. My aunt sighed. It is. But someone has to protect them. I realized then that this wasn't about me defending myself. This was about her needing an audience. Later, when I was alone in the kitchen pouring water, she joined me. I hope you're not upset, she said softly. I looked at her. Why would I be? She smiled sadly. Because sometimes when people get too involved, lines blur. And when money is involved, intentions can get complicated. I felt my pulse spike. Are you saying I've done something wrong? I asked. She placed a hand on the counter, leaning closer. I'm saying, she replied, lowering her voice, that perception matters. And right now, the perception isn't great. There it was. Not truth, not proof. Perception. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded. Then maybe we should clear things up with facts, I said. Her expression tightened, just for a moment. Well, she said lightly, we don't want to upset your grandparents with unnecessary investigations. Unnecessary. I watched her walk back into the living room, immediately switching back into her concerned daughter's smile. That was when I knew. She wasn't worried about their stress. She was afraid of transparency. Over the next 2 weeks, my aunt stayed close to my grandparents. Too close. She offered to handle errands. She insisted on helping with finances. She started intercepting mail. When I tried to visit, she was always already there. Or had just left. Mom's resting, she'd say. They had a long day. Let them relax. At the same time, I heard from others that she'd been telling her version of the story, that I was too dependent on my grandparents, that I'd never really been independent, that I'd made them feel obligated to support me. None of it was true, but it was believable enough. And then came the moment that changed everything. My grandmother called me late one evening, her voice trembling. Emily, she whispered, your aunt says we shouldn't talk about the bank anymore. She says it's better if we don't ask questions. That was the moment the performance cracked. Because people who have nothing to hide don't silence questions. They answer them. I told my grandmother gently, tomorrow I'll come by, and if you want, we'll go to the bank together. Just you and me. There was a long pause. Then she said, I would like that. I hung up knowing one thing for certain. The truth was no longer optional, and my aunt's carefully crafted role was about to meet something she couldn't control. Paper, numbers, and time. The night before we went to the bank, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of what we might find, but because of how long it had taken me to trust my instincts. For weeks, I had been defending myself against a lie instead of asking a simpler question. Where was the money actually going? I kept replaying my aunt's words in my head. Perception matters. She had been right about one thing. Once people accept a narrative, they stop looking for alternatives. And I had almost let that happen when I arrived at my grandparents' house the next morning. My aunt's car wasn't there. That alone felt unusual. She had been present at nearly every visit lately, like a guard. My grandmother greeted me quietly, her hands shaking as she poured coffee. I didn't tell her, she said. About today. That's okay, I replied. This is your account. You don't need permission. She nodded, but I could tell the guilt was already weighing on her. Years of being told to keep the peace had trained her to doubt herself. On the drive to the bank, neither of us spoke much. When we parked, my grandmother hesitated before opening the door. Emily, she said softly, what if we find something we don't like? I met her eyes, Then at least you'll know. Inside, the bank was quiet, neutral, safe in a way that family spaces weren't anymore. We sat with a representative who pulled up the account history. My grandmother clasped her purse tightly while the screen loaded. "Can we print statements for the past few years?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The representative nodded. Of course. Page after page slid out of the printer. At first glance, everything looked normal. Deposits, bills, routine expenses. Then I noticed the pattern. Regular withdrawals, same amounts, same timing, month after month. "These ones," I said carefully, pointing without touching. "Do you recognize these?" My grandmother frowned. "No, I don't think so." "Do you remember authorizing someone else to withdraw cash?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "No." We flipped to the next page. And the next. The doubt that had been sitting quietly in my chest solidified into certainty. This wasn't random. This was systematic. "Who has access to the account?" the representative asked gently. My grandmother hesitated. "Well, your aunt helped us set it up online years ago," she said. "She said it would be easier." I felt my stomach tighten. "Does she have authorization?" I asked. The representative checked. "Yes. She's listed as an authorized user." The room went very still. I looked at my grandmother. Her face had gone pale. "She said it was just in case," she whispered. "In case of emergencies." We kept reading. The withdrawals matched times when my aunt had insisted on handling things, when she'd offered to stop by the bank, when she'd said she'd take care of errands so they wouldn't have to worry. And suddenly, every performance made sense. The concern, the control, the urgency to paint me as a distraction. It wasn't just about money. It was about hiding in plain sight. By the time we finished, the stack of paper felt heavier than it should have. "Can we get copies of all of this?" I asked. The representative nodded again. "I'll organize everything." As we stood to leave, my grandmother's shoulders slumped. "I thought I was being careful," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to accuse anyone." "You didn't," I replied. "You asked questions." On the drive home, she stared out the window. "I told everyone you were helping us," she said quietly. "And now they think you were hurting us." I reached over and took her hand. "That's about to change," I said. But as confident as I sounded, I knew something else too. Facts don't fix families. They expose them. And once the truth was on paper, there was no going back to how things were before. The next step wouldn't be private. It would be public. And the person who had worked the hardest to control the story was about to lose control completely. The bank records didn't shout. They didn't accuse. They didn't explain themselves. They simply existed. A neat stack of paper, clipped together. Each page stamped with dates and numbers that refused to be ignored. When we got back to my grandparents' house, my grandmother placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it as if it might disappear if she didn't look directly at it. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said again, for the third time. "You're not," I replied gently. "You're stopping it." My grandfather joined us a few minutes later. He had been resting, unaware of what we'd uncovered. When my grandmother explained, slowly and carefully, his confusion turned into disbelief. "No," he said. "That can't be right." She wouldn't. I slid the first page across the table. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. The room filled with silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning. Withdrawals, dates, amounts. Over and over again. "This was the month we skipped our anniversary dinner," my grandfather murmured. "We said we couldn't afford it." Another page. "This one," my grandmother added softly, "was when I said we should stop buying fresh fruit." They weren't dramatic about it. They were heartbroken, not because of the money, but because of the trust they had given so freely. "What do we do now?" my grandfather asked. The question wasn't really about finances. It was about family. "We tell the truth," I said. "And we protect your accounts going forward." The first step was practical. We called the bank, removed my aunt's authorization, changed passwords, added alerts. The representative was calm, professional, and very careful with her words. But when she said, "This has been happening for several years," the weight of it finally settled in. Years. Not one mistake, not one emergency. A pattern. By the time we finished, my grandmother looked exhausted. "I don't want to talk to her alone," she said quietly. "You won't have to," I replied. "We decided on one thing. The next family gathering wouldn't be avoided. It would be used." That weekend, my parents hosted dinner. Everyone came. My aunt arrived early, as usual, bringing dessert and that same reassuring smile. She kissed my grandparents' cheeks and asked loudly if they were feeling better. I watched her carefully. There was no guilt on her face, no fear, only confidence. We waited until everyone was seated. No speeches, no raised voices. My grandfather cleared his throat. "I think we need to discuss something," he said. The room stilled, the way it always did when he spoke. My aunt turned toward him instantly. "Of course. Dad, what's going on?" My grandmother reached for the envelope. Her hand shook slightly as she placed it on the table. "These are our bank records," she said. My aunt's smile flickered. "Just once. I don't understand," she replied lightly. "Why are we talking about this now?" My grandfather slid the first page toward her. "We want to know why money has been withdrawn regularly," he said, his voice steady, "and why your name appears on every transaction." The room seemed to hold its breath. My aunt didn't touch the paper. Instead, she laughed softly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "You know banks make mistakes." "Every month?" my grandmother asked. Silence. My aunt finally picked up the page. Her eyes scanned it quickly. Then she looked up, and for the first time since this began, she had nothing ready to say. No performance, no audience control. Just numbers, and the truth sitting between us all. For a moment, no one spoke. The bank statement lay on the table like something dangerous, quiet, undeniable, and sharp. My aunt's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. She read it again, slower this time, as if repetition might change the outcome. "This doesn't prove anything," she said finally, her voice thinner than before. "I was helping them. They asked me to." My grandmother shook her head. "We never asked for this." My aunt turned to her, immediately shifting her tone. "Mom, you don't remember everything clearly anymore. We talked about this." That was when the room changed. My grandfather straightened in his chair. "Do not speak to her like that," he said. "Not now." My aunt blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "I was protecting you," she insisted, "from being taken advantage of." Her eyes flicked toward me. There it was again. The attempt to redirect, but this time, no one followed her gaze. My father spoke up slowly. "How much money are we talking about?" I slid another page forward. "Several years' worth of monthly withdrawals." My mother's hand flew to her mouth as she scanned the total. That's not possible," she whispered. My aunt stood abruptly. "You're all overreacting." "No," my grandmother said softly. "We are finally reacting." The words were gentle, but they landed harder than any accusation. My aunt crossed her arms. "I sacrificed a lot for this family," she said. "If I took some money, it was to make things easier. You all benefited." My cousin frowned. "Benefited how?" Silence again. She had no answer, because the performance required agreement, and for the first time, the audience wasn't cooperating. My grandfather leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell us?" My aunt's voice rose. "Because you would have said no." The room erupted. "That's not permission," my mother snapped. My aunt looked around, searching for support that didn't come. Then she did something desperate. She laughed. "You're really going to believe paperwork over your own daughter?" she asked my grandparents. My grandfather didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word landed clean and final. My aunt's face went pale. For years, she had controlled the narrative by being the loudest, the most involved, the most concerned. Now she was none of those things. She was exposed. "I think you should leave," my father said quietly. My aunt stared at him. You're kicking me out? This isn't a discussion, he replied. She grabbed her purse, her movements sharp and angry. As she reached the door, she turned back toward me. This is your fault, she spat. You turned them against me. I met her eyes. I didn't say anything, I replied. The bank did. She left without another word. The door closed. No one cheered. No one felt victorious. My grandmother began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the sound of someone mourning a version of their family that never really existed. I wrapped my arms around her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have listened to you. I shook my head. You listened when it mattered. That night, the truth didn't fix everything, but it did something just as important. It stopped the damage. The house felt different after my aunt left. Not quieter, just heavier. No one rushed to fill the silence. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue about. The truth had done what it came to do, and then stepped aside, leaving us to deal with the damage. My grandparents didn't talk much that night. My grandmother sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the wall like she was replaying years of memories, searching for the moment she should have seen something differently. My grandfather stood by the window for a long time, his reflection staring back at him. I trusted her, he said finally, not to anyone in particular, just to the room. No one contradicted him. Trust wasn't foolish. It was human. In the days that followed, practical things happened quickly. The bank helped recover a portion of the money, not all of it, but enough to ease immediate worries. New safeguards were put in place. A financial advisor explained things patiently, without judgment, and for the first time in months, my grandparents stopped apologizing for needing help. As for the rest of the family, the shift was quieter, but unmistakable. No one brought up the accusation again. No one apologized either. They avoided the subject the way people do when acknowledging it would require admitting how easily they had believed the wrong person. I didn't push them. I had learned something important through all of this. Vindication doesn't always come with satisfaction. Sometimes it just comes with clarity. My aunt didn't call. Not once. I heard through relatives that she told people her side of the story, that she had been misunderstood, that she had been unappreciated, that the family had turned on her. I let her. She needed a story where she wasn't the villain. I didn't need one at all. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once it was over. For weeks, I had imagined confrontation as something explosive, tears, shouting, dramatic exits. Instead, the most powerful moment had been a single word from my grandfather. Yes. Paperwork over his daughter. Truth over comfort. That was the moment everything changed. I started setting boundaries after that. I didn't attend every family gathering. I didn't explain myself when I declined invitations. I didn't rush to reassure people who suddenly felt awkward around me. I focused on my grandparents, on making sure they felt safe again, on helping them without hovering, without sacrificing myself to be believed. One afternoon, weeks later, my grandmother reached for my hand while we sat on the porch. You know, she said, when she accused you at that dinner, I felt ashamed. Not of you, but of myself. For not speaking up. I squeezed her hand. You did speak up. Just not out loud. She smiled faintly. I'm glad you didn't leave, she said. So am I replied. But I also knew something else. I didn't stay to prove anything. I stayed because I chose to, and if there was one lesson I carried forward, it was this. People who accuse loudly often rely on silence to protect them. People who tell the truth don't need volume. They just need time and records.